Board of Directors, Redevelopment Agency of Salt Lake City. Today is February 8th, 2022. And as you can see, we're holding our meetings remotely. Still, this is due to the continuing spread of COVID variants in keeping with our open meeting requirements. I will read the following statement. As a redevelopment agency board chair, I hereby determine that conducting the RDA meeting at an anchor location presents a substantial risk to the health and safety of those who may be present, based upon recent reports of an increase in COVID-19 cases. Therefore, we have returned to only virtual public meetings to help reduce the transmission of COVID-19. The board will return with hybrid or in-person meetings when appropriate. Thank you. Let's move on to our first agenda item. We start our RDA meetings with comments to the board. Your feedback is always welcomed, and you can share that with the board anytime by mailing the council office at PO Box 145476, Salt Lake City, Utah 84114-5476, or emailing us at council.comments@slcgov.com, or by calling our 24-hour phone comment line at 801-535-7654. We are accepting your comments through WebEx, and for those whose only option is to call in, staff will be monitoring or a separate telephone line. I want to mention our rules of the quorum. These are guidelines to help our meeting progress in an orderly, civil, efficient way. We will move through the agenda and want to give everyone the opportunity to voice their opinion without feeling intimidated. In order to achieve this, our rules of the quorum begin from the moment you arrive into our meeting. The RDA board respects all points of view, and we welcome new insights. Please be respectful. Avoid yelling, profanity, or making racial slurs, obscene, or defamatory remarks. If you use profanity during your comment, your line will be muted. And any comments that reach a level of disrespect, I will ask that you be muted, and you will forfeit your opportunity to address the board today. If you're not able to complete your comments this afternoon, you're welcome to email the board or call our comment line. In addition, our staff will request for your name during the registration process. To limit disruption, your name cannot include a message or violate our rules of the quorum. If your registered name doesn't meet this requirement, then our staff will use the chat feature to gather that information from you. Taylor Hill from our staff is helping to moderate the meeting and will be messaging with the attendees to coordinate on any questions with your commenting registration. Staff is handling a number of tasks. Please limit messages to technical issues and minimal changes to your registration. Taylor will be calling the names of those who wish to comment and unmuting lines. When Taylor unmutes your line and lets you know it's your turn, please state your first and name, indicate the topic you're speaking on, and the 2-minute timer will begin. At the 2-minute mark, we will announce time and your microphone will be muted. We will now open our general comment period. Taylor, please start with our first comment.
Chair, it looks like we do not have anyone here to speak for general comment.
All right. Thank you for that, Taylor. And we have no public hearings today, so moving on to item C1. And that is approval of minutes. The board will approve the meeting minutes of Tuesday, June 9th, 2020. I'm not sure if that's a typo, but anyway, it must be 2022 or 2021 at the latest.
Sorry.
Cindy Lou. Yeah, thanks, Cindy Lou.
Yeah, this is not a typo. These were looked over due to the 2020 circumstances of COVID and transition in the office. So it is correct that they are June of 2020 to approve. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for clarifying that. Wanted to make sure that we had that on record. So I will ask for a motion.
Madam Chair, I move that the board approve the meeting minutes of Tuesday, June 9th, 2020.
Second.
Right, we have a motion by Board Member Dugan, seconded by Board Member Mano. All in favor, say, hold on, do I need to roll call this? Cindy?
Currently, yes, you do need a roll call in this meeting. Thank you.
I'm gonna roll call this. Dugan,
Yes.
Puy,
Yes.
Fowler,
Yes.
Mano,
Yes.
Petro, Eschler.
Yes.
I don't, is Wharton here? He's not, he's absent, and I'm a yes. So that passes. We're moving on to item 2, which is a resolution repealing and replacing the housing allocation policy follow-up. And we will receive a follow-up briefing and consider adopting a resolution repealing and replacing the housing allocation funds policy. And at the table, we have Alison Rowland from our council office, Danny Walls, the RDA COO, Tracy Tran, RDA project manager, and Lauren Parisi, RDA project manager. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am not sure if Tracy and Lauren are actually at the table at the moment, but I'm sure Danny is. So, and they will be on the next one. Just to refresh your memories from last month, I wanted to remind you this is part of the housing allocation funds policy, which was adopted by the board in 2021. And the proposed revisions that Danny will tell you more about, I imagine, are to incorporate the West Side Community Initiative into the Housing Allocations Fund policy, and also add some other revisions related to broader aspects of the policy. I do want to mention also for Council Member Pui, I'm sorry, Board Member Pui, that, no, wait, Co-Chair Pui, Vice Chair Pui, at any rate, he knows who he is, that Danny has provided an update on the funds in what is now the Northwest Quadrant Fund, but will become the West Side Community Initiative. The board may wish to adopt the policy in question today, and Danny can talk about some potential adjustments based on January's discussion. There are a few policy questions in the staff report that you can look up at if you wish, but I'll turn it over to Danny.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Madam Chair and Co-Chair, or Chairperson. Yes, I believe we had Tracy and Lauren at the table for this discussion, just in case there are some items that carry over to the next item, but I will be handling the bulk of the discussion. This is a follow-up briefing on what was originally brought to the board back in September as an initial discussion on the West Side Community Initiative, and then more specifically to your January 18th meeting where we first presented it as part of a resolution requesting and approving the repeal and replacement of our housing allocation funds policy. Primarily, as far as the policy itself, it did put in place some of the higher level goals and direction that we received from the board that we felt applied to all of the housing funds. And then specifically, it renamed the Northwest Quadrant Fund into the West Side Community Initiative Fund, and then carried forward into that the priorities and the direction that we had received from the board as far as the goals and objectives for that fund. I believe we provided that PowerPoint presentation from last month, if there are any details of that the board would wish to get into. And I'm happy to provide any additional details or answer questions that the board may have as part of this discussion. So I will open it up the board as part of that, and whatever anyone's appetite is for getting into the details or any questions.
Thank you, Danny and Allison. Board members, do you have additional questions where your requests from last meeting answered? I think Victoria had some questions last meeting and they may have been answered, but I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I think more my questions now are more procedural and how it works once we're in-house. So I think I've got the right places to ask those questions.
Great. Anybody else? I don't see anybody's hand. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'll ask a
Mano.
question. Just because the words always confuse me. What's it called when we do that thing where there's like all of our goals and we talk about how we want to allocate the money each year?
Yes, that is the annual housing strategy that
And
should be
this is
coming
the
to you.
Housing allocation funds policy. So this is more sort of concrete because it's the actual policy and the strategy is just like our goals for the year. How do I separate those in my brain?
No, you've got it perfectly. As part of both the housing development loan program and then also this housing funds policy, they both point to what is that annual housing strategy, wherein you as a board have input and direction on what our overall housing goals are for specifically what the budget funding requests will be in each fiscal year. So these policies kind of achieve and at a high level provide the priorities and objectives for the specific funds because those are related to the specific sources of money that we receive. And so you have approved those priorities originally as part of this. And then now what you're doing is kind of refining those for how they relate specifically to this West Side Community Initiative. So that's the high level, the umbrella. And then on an annual basis, you will take those, that annual housing funding strategy and that discussion. And that's where you can get into more of the details of how we actually allocate those funds specifically in our budget. And then even more specific, how we roll those out in either programs, projects, or the NOFA offering, and what goals and priorities you as a board want to see in that.
Okay, great. So thank you. That actually does help a lot. So I assume that the strategies document or the strategy discussion will happen sometime in the next few months prior to the fiscal year adoption. Is that correct? And if I
We
remember
are hoping,
last year.
yeah, we are hoping to bring that to you in March as the initial briefing. And then in April, you would hopefully approve that funding strategy right at the same time that we would start presenting the budget. So trying to time that to where you have that to where we can be informed as we present the budget. And at the same time, you can have those priority discussions before you even really approve the budget.
Okay, great. Thanks, Danny. I think the reason why this all connects in my brain is one thing I remember from those discussions was that we had so many goals and things that it's like impossible to ensure that we get a little bit of all of the goals because there's like so many options, which I think it's good that our goals are big. I feel a little similar to that with the West Side Community Initiative. I'm really excited about the West Side Community Initiative. I'm supportive of the idea. I'm just looking at all of the different things that we're trying to do. And I hope that the goal to do everything doesn't get in the way of getting at least some really impactful things done. So it's less of a policy discussion. I think they're all good goals and good directions on them. I think for me, the community land trust and starting to get that affordable home ownership model in place and figuring out what that means is pretty high on my priority list in terms of what all those things are. So I would say I don't have any problems or things that I want to change in this, but I would just say I guess it's a request more that let's really focus on that community land trust model and figure out what that looks like and what the good Salt Lake City version of that is. Is it us running it in-house? Is it a nonprofit that's going to manage the deed restrictions and all that stuff? And how do we make that thing a reality? So I guess that's just because I'm looking at like 7-8 bullet points underneath the West Side Community Initiative. To me, that community land trust is my primary goal of all of those. So more of a comment than a question, but thank you for helping me remember the words of the other things that we do every year.
Perfect. I would just add, I know there wasn't a question in there. Allison, I'm sorry. I think I cut you off. Jump in, please.
You might have been getting ready to tell them how much is in the Northwest Quadrant Fund. I'm trying to set you up to deliver good news, Danny. I want you to be able to do this.
Yes, for the spoiler alert, right now there's only 409,000 that has been set aside, and that's because we've just received basically our first payment from the inland port. You also recall though, as a council, you did approve a $4 million allocation as part of kind of the city budget amendment and that. So we have a significant amount of seed funds to start with, as well as what we hope to be an increasing amount of annual contributions from the port. And then Director Mono, just to follow up on your comment, I know there wasn't a question there, but Tracy and Lauren are both working right now, one on what that land trust model can look like. And then number two, I will just say that that's kind of the nice part of how these funds were set up and what that annual housing strategy can be is you can very much separate the buckets and have different priorities potentially for those different buckets as you as a board want to maybe have those different initiatives or priorities. So where the NOFA has kind of been released citywide, you now, as we start getting funds in these separate buckets, can actually start providing different priorities and objectives for those for us to do throughout the year in the budget. So you're on the right track of what our overall goal was with these funds.
Thank you, Danny.
Could I add one more thing, Madam Chair? Because Danny just doesn't want to look at the glass a little more than full. The original board budget for the Northwest Quad funds, or whatever they were called, yeah, Northwest Quadrant Housing Fund, was 250,000. So the 409,000 is in fact more than the board expected. So that's the good news. The other thing to know is that I believe the council put the or maybe it was the board, put the 4 million that's coming through ARPA in a holding account. And so there'll have to be a budget amendment to be able to free that up when the time comes. So that's just for your background information.
That's great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Darren, for those comments. That's somewhat of the same question that I had last year about can we narrow it down because we have so many things going on. So thanks for bringing that up again and bringing some focus to this WCI, and also thanks to staff that this year they're doing it. They heard us, and then this year they're doing it earlier, so before the budget comes, so that we're all on the same page at the same time, and then we don't get confused. Apologies sometimes to the staff that we get all scrambled when it's when it's different timing, budget, whatever, you guys know. So we appreciate that. And if there's no more discussion on this item, I will gladly move on to the next one.
Madam Chair,
yeah,
if
go
I
ahead.
may interrupt, we would love to see if the board would like to vote to approve the resolution, or if we would like to carry it over for further discussion.
Madam Chair,
Yeah, go ahead.
I would move that we vote for approval.
Second.
So I have a motion by Board Member Fowler to approve this resolution, and a second by Dugan. And do I need to roll call this, or yes? Okay, I see a yes. Let's start with Mano.
Yes.
Petro.
Yes.
Pui.
Yes.
Fowler.
Yes.
Dugan.
Yes.
And I don't see. Oh, I see Wharton in the meeting.
Hello, are we, just so I'm clear, are we voting on repealing and replacing housing allocation funds?
Yes.
Okay, then yes.
And I'm a yes, and so that passes unanimously. So there you go.
Thank you very much.
Great. And now we're ready to move on to item number 3. And this is the board will receive a briefing about and consider adopting resolution that would amend the Housing Development Loan Program policy. And at the table, we have Allison Rowland, Danny Walls, Tracy Tran, Lauren Parisi, same group. as item number 2. So go ahead and tell us.
I'll give a brief intro, Madam Chair. As you may remember, at least those of you who were on the council at the time and on the board, last December, the board requested some clarification from RDA staff on how the housing projects are determined for recommendations to the emergency gap funding part of the Housing Development Loan Program, the HDLP. That sounded terribly garbled. I hope it made more or less sense. In other words, who gets the emergency gap funding? And so the RDA staff has come back with some clarification, some uniform standards, so that they can use those to judge all the requests from. The idea is that these will be offered on these emergency gap funding will be offered on a rolling basis. So rather than having one due date, because projects do get to the time when they might need gap funding and they're able to estimate how much they need, they want to do this on a rolling basis throughout the year. And they recommend, is what I should say, they recommend doing it. And the Redevelopment Advisory Committee, or RAC, met on February 2nd to discuss the proposal. So RDA staff will have some updates about their recommendations. That is basically the broad picture. And the only policy question is whether the board members would like to discuss any adjustments they might like to make to the membership of the RDA Finance Committee, which is the body that would be charged with recommending or not recommending emergency gap funding. So I will turn it over to the RDA staff.
Thanks so much, Allison. I just wanted to see, Taylor, would it be okay if I shared my screen just to pull up a few slides?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Can you see that? Great.
Yes.
Sorry, let me just get this set up real quick. All right, so thanks so much, Allison, for that intro. Like Allison said, we're here to discuss amendments to the Housing Development Loan Program that would include some emergency gap financing criteria. As noted, at the December meeting, the board discussed how loan applications would be reviewed when the RDA releases a notice of funding availability, or NOFA, for emergency gap financing through the Housing Development Loan Program. So RDA staff has proposed some additions and amendments for these emergency funding requests within the Housing Development Loan Program. So as a quick reminder, this might speak to Board Member Amano's earlier question in the previous item, but the HDLP policy was adopted last year, as it provides kind of a centralized process and application for all of the RDA housing funds, which were related to that housing allocation funds policy that we had discussed prior, to provide kind of like a one-stop shop, low interest loans to incentivize the development and preservation of affordable housing within Salt Lake City. So also the RDA presents an annual an annual HDLP funding strategy prior to the budget year that includes proposed revenues and funding priorities to be administered through the HDLP for the next fiscal year. So these HDLP funds are administered through a transparent NOFA process, and it incorporates annual priorities. So this fiscal year's housing strategy, which was adopted by the board through the budget process, offers 3 NOFAs. We had a competitive citywide NOFA, which was reviewed and approved by the board back in December. And then we have the high opportunity area NOFA, which was advertised through the latest competitive NOFA, but these funds do remain open on an ongoing basis due to the nature of the difficulty in getting projects within those areas. And we have the emergency gap financing funds, which is the last NOFA that we would release this fiscal year and is the topic of today's discussion. So for each NOFA, RDA staff evaluates and considers applications for approval as follows. So there's kind of 4 steps. The first is that we conduct an eligibility review. And then that goes to a The applications are then provided to a review committee where a recommendation of the funding is made. Then from there, that is forwarded on to the RDA Board of Directors for approval. And then we would offer a funding commitment based on the board's decision. And the proposed changes that we're discussing today would just impact the first two sections, the eligibility review and then the review committee recommendation. So the staff proposed changes within the HDLP, including adding language that basically if allocated by the board through the annual funding strategy, these emergency funds may be available and must be able to show three things. One, that the projects must be able to break ground within 6 months. So typically projects at this stage would have secured tax credits, which is a timely and competitive process. And projects would also have a little more detailed construction drawings, and they would perhaps be ready to pull a building permit and have other sources of funding secured, which would be the second requirement of these proposed amendments. So projects would need to have at least 90% of their financial commitment secured, and we would need proof of that. And then finally, projects would also need to submit a funding gap analysis that explains what is causing the gap and provide supporting documents that demonstrate the need for the specific amount being requested. So I just want to add to this, we have been seeing kind of just the supply chain issues and the rise in construction costs. We have been hearing a lot in the community, in the construction community, that there is because of that, we are seeing more of a need for kind of last minute emergency funds. So during the reviews of this policy, it was noted that it may make sense to direct the RDA Finance Committee as a review body for the HDLP. The current language in the HDLP refers to a review committee, but it doesn't specify the Finance Committee, and the Finance Committee meets monthly and is charged with reviewing things such as loans and tax increment reimbursements and things like that. So it does make sense for them to review these HDLP loan requests. And this process would just streamline and kind of simplify the administrative procedures. It wouldn't really change much, I think, with this process. And so we did, as Allison noted, we did take this to RAC last week, and they did have quite a discussion on emergency funds, and they did recommend approval with the following considerations. So they wanted to, one, reevaluate the criteria such that the 6-month window is shortened to a much shorter time frame that represents a truly ready to close time frame, and they suggested that would be 90 days at most. The second would be to reevaluate the approval process to allow for very quick action, a very quick approval process, and maybe contingent approval first and then finance committee approval. That would remove board approval. So that's just a question we wanted to definitely discuss with the board today. And the third one would be consider a matching fund component from the developer to the emergency fund. So with those, we wanted to definitely bring this up and just discuss this with the board today. So one, the RAC recommendation would require a change in the current process. And would the board like to create a shorter process for emergency requests? Would additional details in the standards make the board comfortable to delegate authority for emergency funding requests? And we understand accomplishing an emergency funding process is difficult with the current process. And if it doesn't make sense to establish a shorter time frame, it may make sense to allocate these funds for another NOFA use. So with that, I just wanted to kind of open it up for any questions and discussions. And I think Lauren will join for that portion.
Thank you, Tracy. That was a great presentation. So lots of questions for the board members. Anybody would like to say something about this, have questions, concerns? I'll start while you guys think about it if you want. Tracy, on the emergency funds, do we have I can't remember if we have like a max, like does that number change every year, or how will we do that?
Are you talking with each application that submits, or just like our pot of emergency
Our
funds?
pot, yeah, our pot of funds.
Yeah, so that's kind of determined through the budget process each year, and kind of what's, what was spent last year. And so for this year, I think we have about 2 million
Okay.
left. And so that could change next year.
Next year, okay. So basically so if somebody called in today and said, I'm short $2 million and we're starting construction in 6 months, then they would go through the committee and then come to us, and then we would release those funds. And the 2 million, like, even if it was the max that what we have, we would technically help them.
Yes.
with all
Yeah,
of
as
those
long as
funds.
they
Okay.
follow kind of, as long as we get all the correct documentation and
Okay.
And just
I mean, I'm all about expediting things, especially if it's an emergency situation where you're about to start construction, and then your contractor sent you, a new bid saying, hey, cost has gone way up and this is our price now. So that's real. It is happening. At the same time, these are funds that are large in number, and I'm not sure about, I don't know, not so sure about not having overview, like just leaving it to another decision-making body. Ultimately, I feel like we are responsible for where those funds go, so that's why I have a harder time letting go, I guess. But
Madam
there-
Chair?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think in clarifying in some of our initial internal discussions, I think that it would still come to the RDA board for final approval, and that
Okay.
the finance committee would recommend to the RDA board.
Madam Chair,
Yeah, go ahead.
would there be a possibility to add something in order to expedite the front end of getting the money? Would there be a possibility that we could add something on the back end, like a grant report or something that could still promote accountability but expedite the process on the front end?
So basically, how would it look like? You're saying, hey, here's the
So
here's
for us,
the request.
so for like my nonprofit during COVID, we did some things where, there was the funding available. We submitted for it. Well, I mean, the PPP loans worked this way, right? And you signed off and you said, I'll meet all these criteria. And then at the forgiveness period, you had to log back in and you had to check off and say, I did this, did this, did this, did this, with whatever verifications were asked for. And then if you didn't, there was a penalty that would come to you and your organization. Otherwise, the conditions, like we could set something like that, which would help us get things out sooner, but not decrease accountability.
True, yeah, that's fine, but this is not a grant. This is an emergency loan. Like, regardless if you used it right or not, you have to return it.
We could still assess a penalty or something, still do something like promoting accountability without causing more time in advance.
Yeah, that would be fine. Go ahead, Darren.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So Jennifer, to clarify, it sounded like what you said, that it would be the committee recommending and the board making a final approval was original, but the RAC is suggesting that we change it to where the board does not need to do final approval. Am I understanding that all accurately, Tracy? So the RAC's proposal is to take us potentially out of the process for emergency loans altogether so that it can go faster.
Correct. That was their recommendation, and that was just, I think they wanted us to kind of explore different ways that could happen, and I think that was the way that they saw would be a faster process if they maybe had final approval, but we could maybe still come back to the board, perhaps to report what had happened, or those things that we can kind of discuss and think through as we go through this process.
Madam Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Cindy.
Another option is that you could, we could just put into more practice the idea that the RDA can convene a meeting on a regular council night. So you're not waiting for a once a month approval. You have 3 shots at getting something approved by the council. And then I think it'd be good to ask Katie whether this is a situation that is parallel to some of the other situations where we were just realizing we needed to do a little bit of restructuring so that we were meeting all of the aspects of the open meetings law. I can't tell if this is finance committee, and if the finance committee is a public body, or maybe we're okay because it's the RAC. I don't know. So those are my 2 things. Number 1 is we can just have a meeting convened at any time on any council night. And then the second is the clarification from the attorneys. Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds great to me. Is that something that maybe Allison, or I see Katie, just saw Katie's name, but I don't know if she was up anyway. Allison Parks or Katie, any thought on this?
Hi there, RDA board members. Nice to see you. We'd like to take a look at this and get back to you if that's all right, but we appreciate Cindy flagging it because as she mentioned, we are doing a holistic review of all of our various recommending finance committees.
So that basically tells us that we need to answer those questions at some other time. So let's continue the discussion right now. But if you have, Dan Dugan has his.
Thank you, Chair. Questions on the 90 days. Does that give us enough time to for the Finance Committee and us to make a recommendation without if it was at the maximum of a board? We have an RDA board meeting in the first week. They put the recommendation in the day before. Do we still have time to make that within that 90-day window? And on that, is there how much money are we talking about on these loans and the interest rates on the loans? And if it would be, hey, there's a threshold, anything below X amount of dollars, the Finance Committee can approve X plus 1, the board requires to approval. And also, how many of these emergency loans are we talking about a year? Is this 1, 10, 100? A lot of questions there, all in once.
I'll hopefully try to answer all of them. Please remind me if I missed a question, but I think your first question was whether or not 90 days is sufficient time period to go through the process. I definitely think it is a little tight, but it will require, I think, a lot of coordination with kind of our administrative staff and council staff to make sure that we can get meetings scheduled and on agendas. I think we can do, as long as we receive all the information from the applicant, we can review that, as a staff fairly quickly. But I think it's, making sure that we can get the transmittals in on time and things like that we'll want to coordinate on. Let's see, and then you had asked about the interest rates.
Question on that point before we move on to Dan's next question. Isn't the 90 days that the project, like from when we approve the funding, the project needs to be able to start within 90 days, not 90 days that we have to internally go through our process to approve that funding?
I can speak to that.
Oh, go ahead, Lauren.
Go ahead, Tracy. Well, how it's written now, how we have it proposed is that the project should be able to break ground within, we have it written as 6 months, but then the RAC's recommendation would be 90 days. So that 6 months, though, as it's written now, would incorporate the review, and then they would have to break ground within that time frame.
But when does that clock start? Once we approve the funding, or once they put the application in?
Submit an application.
Oh, okay, that's different. Okay, thanks.
So back in terms of the interest rates would be subject to the Housing Development Loan Program rate. So it generally is based off of it's generally based off of the US Treasury yield plus a percentage, plus 2%, I think, but it doesn't go above 3%. And they can get interest rate reductions based on any kind of priorities that they meet. So they can potentially get a 0.5% interest rate reduction if they meet certain priorities.
And are these short-term loans? Are these short-term, like 5 years, or are they long-term?
There's a range. They can be short-term. It could be like anywhere from like a short-term construction loan to like a 30-year.
Oh, okay, okay.
And I may have forgotten.
And how many emergency loan requests do you have a year?
That one's a little hard to gauge because we haven't had like an official like emergency program before. I would say that we do get requests and people calling us to see if we have extra funds. I would say just in the last few months, I've probably had maybe 2 or 3 developers that have just been calling just to see if we have any available. I do think we are in a unique situation just currently with the supply chain issues, and one of the developers I spoke with said a lot of construction bids aren't lasting more than 2 weeks. So we're just seeing continual price escalations. So even with a 3-month process, we could see some, additional cost increase during that period. It's a little hard to gauge right now.
Okay, thanks.
That's a little nightmarish, Tracy, if things change every 2 weeks. Anyway, board members, do you guys have any other questions? Darren, you had that question about the 90 days. Are you okay with the 90-day as per RAC's recommendation, or should we do 6 months?
Well, I was going to say the 90-day sounded great, but if they submit an approval, we have to go through the whole approval process, and then they must break ground from 90 days from the day that they submit. That does feel a bit tight. If it was, you have to break ground within 90 days of us approving your loan, because it's like they may have like a bunch of different funding streams, and they might not know if they need to pursue this one if ours isn't approved. But I think like if we say, yes, you can have that and your 90-day clock starts now, you have 90 days to break ground. And if in that 90 days, if you can't pull it together in 90 days, then that loan is no longer available to you. But you have that 90 days now you have more information. You have 90 days to figure out all the rest of everything and then start the process. That seems like it makes more sense from a project management standpoint than having part of that 90 days being us making the decision as to whether they're approved for that loan.
Right, because it could take us 75 days to approve it. They got to break ground the next Monday, right? It's like, holy cow.
Yeah. But I mean, if it was the other way around where the clock starts from when we approve the loan, then absolutely, let's go down to 90 days. Because 6 months is a long time. And as we said, things change every 2 weeks in construction. So I would be comfortable going down with that, but then if it's inclusive of the entire review process, then I think that that's probably a little bit potentially unrealistic.
I think I agree with you, Darren. I think it's unrealistic.
Yeah, I agree with you all. And I think something we could do is make the 90 days a condition of approval. So again, if they don't break ground within that 90 days, maybe the loan they're not meeting that condition. Is that correct, Danny and Tracy?
Yeah, I like that distinction. I think that also helps us on the front end of the timing with the board meetings. I really appreciate Cindy jumping in and stating that if we had to, we could maybe piggyback on a regular scheduled council meeting, because I think with transmittal times and everything, that would certainly provide us a few more options than just our regular monthly meeting. So if we can maybe noodle on that and bring that back as part of the next step, we can certainly look at that and see what that looks like as kind of a final version of wording. Unless Tracy, you have any thoughts or concerns on that?
I think that's. Sorry, dog is barking.
It's okay. We didn't hear it. I didn't hear it.
Can I ask the next
ahead.
question then?
Yes, go ahead, Darren.
In your, so the consider matching funds a component from developer to the emergency fund, what does that mean? Because the developer's already coming up with a bunch. We're never the 100% financer on a project, right? So what does it mean when we ask them for matching funds? Because don't they always have matching funds?
Yeah, I think this is something we'll want to think through a little bit. But I think the thought behind it was that if they are going to ask us for some emergency funds, that they would also need to have some matching funds from another new source. So let's say there's like 500,000 they're asking for us, they would also need to get 500,000 from, let's say, like an Olin Walker emergency fund, or I don't know if that exists, but something like that.
So
That's not
Tracy,
hard to track because which funding was before or after the approval? Did they just not tell us that they already had this other fund? You know, seems like there's a lot of loopholes to that matching funds thing. Can we say that our funding must always exceed the developer's fee by a certain percentage so that we're not just, you know, like if they're, maybe that's not the way to do it, but I think the matching funding, if they're all of a sudden in this hard situation, are we the only ones that are giving up more money, or does the project as a whole reduce their?
I'm really glad
You know what I mean?
because I think one of the discussion points for that matching funds, that we could require them to make sure that they're deferring like their max developer fee as like a matching portion for what we are, what they may ask us for. Does that make sense?
So Tracy, um, because we vote, so obviously I think this project that may come with this request is because we've helped them in the past, right? We were participants at some point for the project to come along, unless we're also taking requests from random development, but I don't think so. Is that true? So somebody would come to us, say, hey, we're short. You guys already helped us in the past, but things have changed. We're short. Can you help us again? I would also hope that, yeah, we want to do emergency funding, but that we're not just the only ones. You know, like footing the bill. Like, I'm sure there are banks and other lenders as well out there available for that. So hypothetically they have a gap of $500,000, maybe we say we'll review $250,000, but then you have to find the other $250,000 elsewhere. Or is that too complicated for you guys, for everybody to make it happen? I mean, because you have to review and see where this money is coming from and that it's available, right? I don't know. Help me think.
I do think kind of the intention of these funds is that there would be a true specific gap that they could really nail down with their construction bids, and it would really be an urgent need. And so I do think the matching component might cause a little bit of trouble because there's that timeliness issue. And of course, initially with a regular loan, we're looking for those other contributions and other sources. But here it might be difficult to get that match. But again, something we could do is make sure that that developer fee is deferred as kind of that matching component.
Okay. All right. I see nods and I see
And
Thumbs up.
Madam Chair, to your
go ahead.
first question about whether the funds would be limited to projects that the RDA is already helping, I believe the way the proposal is written, that would not be the case, but I hope Tracy or Lauren could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, that's correct. I think the way the policy is written, it doesn't restrict who can apply for those funds. It could be someone who's already applied. It could be a new applicant, but they would just have to meet the standards within the policy, all the other standards in the policy.
And within an RDA area, obviously.
Well, within
Unless
a city,
or
housing
what-
can be done citywide within the.
Right. Okay. All right.
But in those cases, sorry, I don't want to prolong this longer than you want to, Madam Chair. I just was curious about in terms of what the RDA might ask of a developer who hasn't gone through the NOFA process before, whether the RDA could potentially say, okay, but affordable units, we need this amount at this affordability level, something like that. So that might be an idea worth pursuing, or RDA might tell me not so much.
I feel like that clarification is important because I feel like RDA money should be going towards those goals that are hard to encourage the free market to reach. So it should be going towards affordability, family size units, those things that we've set as priorities, even in an emergency.
I'm okay with that.
So the
Let's-
way
let's
the
add
current
that.
policy is written, I think it just requires at least 20% of the units to be affordable at 60% AMI. That's a baseline requirement. Just wanted to clarify that.
Okay.
Thanks, Tracy. I think that's a good distinction because I think as part of the annual housing strategy, if you did, as a board, want to put a condition or a term like that on these emergency funds, you can certainly do that. I think we just probably need to have you discuss that as part of the annual housing strategy of whether you do want to loosen those guidelines a little bit for emergency funds because you're just trying to get a project over the finish line versus what we actively put out for projects at a much higher threshold with priorities. So something that we can discuss further in the annual housing strategy.
I've never been a developer, so I don't know. If I'm a developer and I've got 20% units at 70% AMI or 60% AMI, whatever the threshold is, and I have an emergency, and I go and look for traditional bank-based or investor-based emergency funds in a case like this. And there's another developer who is doing, 30% at 40% AMI. Is there going to be a discrepancy in those two developers' ability to secure emergency funding outside of some governmental intervention like this? Is there a reason we should be looking out for that developer who's digging deeper to help us with the affordability crisis, potentially?
Maybe to me, sorry, Darren, maybe to me, yes. I mean, if we can put it as a priority, but I think we should leave it open because I'm not sure if, if that will always, there will always be the emergency. So yeah, we could probably give more priority to those, but still help the other ones as well. Go ahead, Darren.
I mean, I guess I would say if we're loosening up the process and we're creating an alternative track around traditional RDA processes to get money faster because it's an emergency, I would say we make the process easier, but make the affordability requirements more strict. Like say, if here's your general baseline to participate in RDA, then you have to have 20% at 60% AMI or whatever that is. If you want to apply for our emergency funding, which is going to be super easy and fast to get, because let's be honest, every project in development can claim an emergency and it's probably legitimate because that's just the nature of development. So if you're going to be able to if you're going to be able to qualify for this additional sort of fast tracked funding, then let's just put the threshold more strict, but make the process easier. I'm not sure that I'm yet comfortable making the threshold higher or lower, whatever, make the threshold less stringent and also make the process faster. Because that feels like, then why is anyone getting even applied to our normal funding unless there's also, I mean, I could, or make the cap lower, right? Like the amount of, you can only get 200,000 in emergency funding, not 2 million or whatever the case may be. But there has to be some trade-off to go through this alternative route. Otherwise, people are just not going to do our normal process. But maybe our normal process needs consideration as well, but that's a different topic, right?
Right. I agree with you guys. I just wonder, like, if, if we might, I mean, if we're also, if we're letting an opportunity of affordable housing at any AMI, like, not happen because we are really stuck on the, on the super duper affordable ones. So that's why that's what I wonder. If it's too strict, but yeah, I understand, like, there must be a trade-off for sure if we're going to go through this whole process and this whole issue of restructuring and getting this fast track set up. Go ahead, Amy.
So I think
oh, sorry.
it's okay. I feel very confused with this idea of making, and the whole point of this emergency funding is that there is an emergency. And yes, to Darren's point, I think anybody could claim that there's an emergency in development, but also, like, for me, anyone that ever gets any RDA money has a bunch of requirements that they have to go through, and it doesn't seem like we're trying to take that away. And I don't like, I get needing more affordable housing and things. It just seems like we're, in an effort to try to make things easier for people to get some emergency money, we're making it more difficult and with more hoops for them to jump through. And that seems to be outside of the goal of what emergency funding is. I mean, to me, if in that case, we should just set, like, standards for anybody, and then anyone applies would have to meet those standards. This to me says you have to have a legitimate emergency that we've defined. You have to be able to break ground within a certain time, and you have no other options, or this project is going to fail. Now, believe me, you all know that I hate the but for argument, and it makes me want to throw my computer out the window. But, like, this seems like these are one of those moments where it really is a but for, or it's not going to happen. And we already have so many requirements to even engage with the RDA in the first place that it concerns me that it's almost like we're cutting off our nose to spite our face in some ways, right? And I just want to throw that out there.
Thanks, Amy. I see what you're saying. So,
Madam Chair.
whatever. Yeah, go ahead.
I think this has been really great input from the board, and obviously if anyone has any other comments or questions, we'd be happy to ask, but I'm wondering if it's appropriate for us to kind of take some of these ideas and come back with some options of how we think we may be able to address it, or where we think it's appropriate to move some of these levers, as Director Mono and Director Fowler have kind of indicated what we should really be looking at, and bring it back to the board with what we feel are the priorities and objectives of using these emergency funds, and then where we can address the board's concerns of the appropriate points to put priorities, objectives, and then how the process follows that.
Yep, that's great, Danny. If you guys have enough from us, then go ahead, and we'll await for your proposal and your mind reading powers.
And I would just look at Tracy and Lauren as if they had anything else from RAC that we needed input or direction on, or if we're good.
think we're good. We'll definitely take all of this feedback and see what kind of options there may be for this process. We really appreciate your input. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
so
very much.
All right. So we are at item 4, which is a report and announcements from the executive director, which is Mayor Mendenhall. Sure if she's here or if she sent.
Sorry, Madam Chair, she's not here yet.
All right. Then we'll move on. Sorry, Rachel, is she planning on attending?
She will be here. I'm not sure if she'll be here before the end of the RDA meeting or not, but please
All
feel free
right.
to pass along anything to me that you need her to follow up on.
Thank you. We'll continue then with item number 5, and if she comes to the meeting before we're done, then we're happy to give her the time. Item number 5 is the report announcements from RDA staff. So Danny?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the board, I had 2 quick updates. We just wanted to inform the board. Number 1, we have executed a lease amendment with essentially the Utah Jazz for extending their lease for the property under the Vivint Arena. That lease currently runs to 2040. We have provided 2 additional 10-year options to extend that for their group. And then part of that amendment, those were really the biggest terms. The other change is really just updating what was arguably a 30-plus-year-old agreement now as part of the transfer of ownership and changes in that regard. So happy if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out and provide that, but wanted to give that update because I know some of you have been involved in conversations or tracking that. Second item is the reopening event for the Jackson Apartments has been rescheduled for Thursday, February 24th. At 10 a.m. Madam Chair, I believe you're still slated to be a speaker at that event, along with the mayor. And just to recap, RDA provided $1 million loan for the Jackson Apartments there on 3rd West to renovate and bring up to code and make better ADA improvements and accessibility for 80 senior apartments there. So we look forward to seeing everyone at that can attend. That's all I have, unless there are questions from the board.
Thanks, Danny. No, board members, do you guys have questions? No, I appreciate your work. We welcome the Jazz and the new owners in Salt Lake City, and we're happy to participate as an RDA and all the stuff that they bring along, which is name recognition, people downtown, and a lot of fun for all of Utah. So thank you. And then excited to be at the Jackson Apartments February 24th. We are moving on to item D, which is written briefings, and we have none. And consent, we have none. I believe we have a closed session for advice of counsel, and we will need a motion for that. But a friendly reminder that everybody make sure that you're in a closed area in a room by themselves during the closed session.
And Madam Chair, before you entertain a motion, could it please also be for the purposes of discussing pending and reasonably imminent litigation and deployment of security devices and personnel and advice of counsel? And whoever makes the motion can just say all 3 of those things that Katie said, and that's fine.
Great, thank you, Katie.
Madam Chair, I move that we move to closed sessions as per Katie's comments.
Second.
Thank you. So we have a motion by Board Member Dugan and seconded by Board Member Pui. I'm going to roll call this. Board Member Dugan,
Yes.
Fowler,
Yes.
Wharton,
Yes.
Mano,
Yes.
Petro Eschler,
Yes.
Pui,
Yes.
and I'm a yes. So Once again, friendly reminder, make sure you're in a closed area, in a room by themselves or by yourselves during the closed session.
Madam Chair,
Yeah, go ahead.
would you also clarify for the public if you'll be returning to the RDA or if the conclusion of your closed session will be the adjournment?
The conclusion of our session will be the adjournment of the RDA
Thank you.
meeting. All right, well,
if-
Jen, do we have a separate link?
We're going to stay in this link. So if everyone could just give us a minute or two to sort through which attendees are appropriate to be here and which ones.